Today, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of the female gaze in visual art. There are many places where one could start with this discussion, and I'm going to start at the Bel Ami art competition. In 1945, director Albert Lewin hosted a contest for his upcoming film, The Private Affairs of Bel Ami. As a brief summary, the film follows Georges Duroy, a vain, handsome, ruthless, and immoral man who uses and manipulates women to gain status and social notoriety. Lewin's vision was that the film was to be set entirely in black and white, apart from a single shot of a painting that would be symbolic to the film's story. For this painting, Lewin invited 11 surrealist painters to submit their own depictions of The Temptation of St. Anthony. If you're unfamiliar with the story of The Temptation of St. Anthony, Widewall's online art magazine summarizes the story as this, quote, St. Anthony of Egypt was one of the first monks to retire to the desert to devote himself to fasting and prayer. During the time of his retreat to the desert, St. Anthony began his legendary fight with the devil, withstanding a series of temptations. The devil's assault on Anthony took the forms of visions, either seductive or horrible, and also in the form of actual physical assaults. At times, the temptations appeared as a monk bringing bread during his fasts, or in the form of women, wild beasts, or soldiers. From these psychic struggles, Anthony emerged as the sane and sensible Christian father of monasticism, and as a symbol of the never-dying force of faith, unquote. Now, over the years, this story has been a largely popular subject of visual art with an incredibly diverse range of interpretations. A common depiction is that of sexual temptation. Often in these depictions, St. Anthony is surrounded by soft and sensual feminine figures who are either coy and passive or are lustfully throwing themselves upon him. Surrealist artist Dorothea Tanning submitted her interpretation to the Bel Ami art competition. In Tanning's painting, St. Anthony is on his knees, cowering in fear beneath a tornado of breasts and feminine forms. Rather than soft human flesh, we see sexual, voluptuous demons with green scales and horns. A frightening shadow figure with long, flowing hair and a full feminine hourglass body is seen approaching from the distance. Unlike male artists' depictions of sexual temptation, the women in this painting are not coy and passive, nor are they needily looking to St. Anthony as a source of pleasure. They are demons, and they're in full knowledge of the power that they possess. There's an energy to this painting that is not noticeably present in other depictions of St. Anthony's sexual temptation. That energy comes from the female gaze. To understand the significance of the female gaze, it helps to first understand the male gaze. The gaze refers to the way in which a viewer perceives visual media. The concept of the male gaze was coined by filmmaker Laura Mulvey in 1970. The idea originated in film theory, but honestly it can be applied to any art form that we study. The male gaze is defined as, quote, the perspective of a notionally, typically heterosexual man considered as the embodiment of the audience or intended audience for films and other visual media. It is characterized as a tendency to sexualize women, unquote. In the history of all visual art and literature, women have mostly been depicted through the eyes of the often heterosexual male gaze. Historically, female subjects and characters have been categorized into one of a few reductive tropes. One common trope that we see is that of the Madonna, aka the good girl or the mother figure. She's often depicted as pure, beautiful, domestic, and virginal. We also see the whore as a trope, aka the bad girl, who's often depicted as sexually devious and immoral. She may sometimes appear as sexually intriguing to the male viewer, but it is always revealed that her intentions are impure. The third major trope is that of the spinster, aka the old maid. This character is depicted as old or unattractive. She has no sexual appeal and is therefore destined to be alone and unloved. Over centuries, these reductive tropes have fundamentally shaped the way that society sees women and how we see ourselves. This is a problem, because women are not the dichotomous creatures that we've often been portrayed as. Women can simultaneously be both feminine and muscular, conventionally unattractive with sexual confidence, seemingly put together but struggling with mental health issues, and kind-hearted with outspoken strong opinions. Traditional portrayal of women through the male gaze tells us that pairings like these are rare and paradoxical, when in fact, they are not. So what is the female gaze? It might be easy to think of the female gaze as simply the inverse of the male gaze, to think, well, if the male gaze sexualizes and objectifies women, then I guess the female gaze is meant to sexualize and objectify men. But that's not the case. Although the concept of the male gaze was established in 1970, the female gaze was not coined until 2016. It was established by another filmmaker, Joey Solloway, during their keynote speech at the Toronto International Film Festival. In this speech, Solloway establishes that the female gaze achieves three primary things. 1. The female gaze is a way of seeing feelings. It allows the viewer not only to see the subject, but to evoke empathy and to feel what the subject is feeling, whether the subject is male, female, or perhaps not even a human at all. It prioritizes emotion. 2. The female gaze shows the viewer how it feels to be the object of the gaze, of being aware of our place in the world and how we are perceived. 3. The female gaze dares to return the gaze. It tells the viewer, this is how it feels to stand here in the world, having been seen our entire lives. Solloway said this, quote, I want you to see the female gaze as a conscious effort to create empathy as a political tool. It is a wrestling away of the point of view, unquote. Now with that said, I want to look at another comparison of the male and female gaze in classical art. Like the temptation of St. Anthony, the story of Judith beheading Holofernes is another story that has been a popular subject for visual artists over the years. The story is this. Judith was a Jewish widow whose village was under siege by the Assyrian army. The Assyrian general Holofernes developed a great desire for Judith, and so she was able to gain access to his tent under the guise of seduction. That night, when Holofernes had finally passed out from heavy drinking, Judith slayed the Assyrian general and saved her people. These three depictions were painted by male artists. In the painting on the far left, we see a cool, unbothered, and well-kept Judith smiling coyly with her prize. In the center painting, a naked Judith stands over Holofernes with an almost flirtatious and seductive smile. In the painting on the far right, Judith is depicted as a soft and petite young woman. She holds her weapon hesitantly, seemingly unsure of what she's doing. The agony and struggle shown in Holofernes do not seem to match the strength that Judith is putting forward. In my opinion, none of these paintings really depict the pain, anger, and urgency of a woman who's driven to kill in order to save the lives of everyone in her village. Now, Artemisia Gentileschi was an Italian Baroque artist who was actually a family friend of the artist Caravaggio, whose painting we viewed on the previous slide. Although she has the privilege of being one of the few honored and recognized female artists of her time, this doesn't mean that her life was without struggle. In 1612, at the age of 17, Gentileschi reported that she had been raped by her teacher, Agostino Tassi. Over the course of a 6-month trial, Gentileschi faced relentless harassment and backlash for having made the claim against such an established and well-respected member of the community. Despite the harassment, and although Tassi was cleared of the allegations by having friends in high places, Gentileschi never wavered from her claims. She was perhaps pulling from this experience when she completed her own depiction of Judith slaying Holofernes. In Gentileschi's painting, Judith is a more full-figured and muscular woman, but still feminine. She shows no hesitation, and there's no question about her intense emotions as she bears down on top of Holofernes, driving the sword through his neck. Because of her own experiences, Gentileschi was able to fully depict the power and emotion of a scorned woman seeking revenge, something that the male artists likely could not personally relate to and were therefore unable to convey in their paintings. Now, take a look at these 4 depictions of the same story, and recall what Joey Solloway said about the female gaze as seeing feelings and evoking empathy. Back to Bel Ami. I'd ask you again to reflect on Solloway's words as we revisit Dorothea Tanning's depiction of the temptation of St. Anthony. The female gaze shows the viewer how it feels to be the object of the gaze, and it gazes right back. To me, Tanning's painting says, I know you're looking at me. I know what it is you see, and I want you to know what that feels like. It's an incredibly powerful piece. Now, in case you were wondering, Tanning's painting was not selected as the winner for the Bel Ami art competition. That title went to her partner, Max Ernst. Also, Salvador Dali's submission became one of his more well-known works. As for Tanning, her name, her painting of the Temptation of St. Anthony, and many of her other works are often left out of the conversation about the Surrealist movement. Speaking personally, I think that her lack of representation in our cultural history is a disservice to other young female artists, and if you're so inclined, I would encourage you to look into her work for yourself. In their keynote speech at the Toronto International Film Festival, Joey Solloway said, quote, "Art is propaganda for the self," unquote. We create art as a way to tell our stories and share our points of view, but not just that. The most resonating art does more than just say, "This is my story." It relates to the viewer. It touches the viewer on a personal level. It does more than show and does more than tell. Through the lens of the female gaze, artwork evokes a sense of empathy, understanding, and a greater sense of compassion for the artist's experience. Thank you.